Oh, that was the house telephone, madam. Probably the head gardener wishing instructions.
Did you want to see me, Mrs. Danvers?
Mr. De Winter informed me that his sister, Mrs. Lacey, and Major Lacey are expected for luncheon. I'd like to know if you approve of the menu.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's very suitable, very nice indeed.
You'll notice, madam, that I've left a blank space for the sauce. Mrs. De Winter was most particular about sauces.
Let's have whatever you think that Mrs. De Winter would have ordered.
Thank you, madam.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Sam Guilaumé, who is the CEO of Aryballe. I want to thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you have a very interesting background. I believe your co-founder Tristan from the biology side and yourself from the sensor and semiconductor side. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you at some point realized that there's this big gap in the marketplace when it came to sensors and in particularly digital olfaction?
Tristan and I, we met each other about 10, 15 years ago, and we are serial entrepreneur, if you can call it this way. We both actually had companies on each of us before, and I came from the semiconductor industry, while Tristan was more on the pharmaceutical and biological industry, after each of us actually sold our company, we had this unique opportunity. Actually, Tristan identified this opportunity of a technology that could very much mimic the the sense of smell. Since he understood there was a dimension about the sensor and semiconductor, not being in his background, he invited me to the party. And we decided with 2 other founders to start the company about 7 years ago.
Amazing. And for the listeners that are not familiar with digital olfaction, maybe you can describe it a little bit for us, please.
Of course. So olfaction is the sense of smell, and what we are doing at Aryballe is to essentially mimic the sense of smell. Using semiconductors and using biosensors. So eventually it's a sense that anyone will be able to duplicate using a connected device, using a smartphone, for instance, or having such a feature in your car, in your fridge, at home, in your smart speaker. So it's a way to capture the sense of smell, which is something that we cannot do today, right? So we can actually, as humans, of course, we can capture olfaction, but we cannot actually digitally capture olfaction. So this is what it's all about, the sense of smell.
Now, for those that are listening, I think some of them that are perhaps maybe old enough recall during the, let's say, 70 plus years ago, when they would actually try to introduce the notion of smell dimension to movie theaters, for example, for that experiential aspect. Here, we're not talking about the creation of smell, but rather the capture of molecules or biomarkers, which I guess in the closest sense is, in a military context, let's say a homeland security context, its ability to detect, let's say, gases or dangerous types of molecules, including chemicals, for example, in the air. But here it's apply more to the commercialization side. Is that correct?
It is correct. Actually, there is maybe one nuance we need to tackle here. It's our nose doesn't really smell gases, or most of the gases we cannot smell. For instance, if you take carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, for instance, we cannot smell those gases. And they are very small, tiny molecules. And our nose is not an instrument made to capture, small molecules like this. We are more into the what experts call volatile olfactive compounds. So these are typically bigger molecules that our nose can capture and detect and analyze. So you're right. We are in really what we do at Aryballe is capturing the smell. And there is something which is very interesting. I find is that if you take light, for instance, we know that light is it's a three-dimensional space. With red, green, and blue, essentially, you can make any type of light, right? Any color. We don't know how many dimensions you have in the sense of smell, so we don't know if there is anything such as primary odors that we could use to recombine any odors, right? So capturing a smell, we think it is the beginning before we can eventually synthesize any smell if it can be possible one day, right? So really we're starting with the basics. It's all about capturing the smell and again understanding if there is such a thing as primary odors. We'll see.
Yeah, I appreciate you providing that distinction because, again, we already have CO2 smoke detectors that, to your point, is more, let's say, more smaller molecules. The volatile ones are really the ones that our senses tends to pick up. And the kinds of use cases and applications we're going to talk about are really oriented towards the consumer experience. And hence, it's important for us to be able to actually recognize that. Before we get into kind of more of the technology side, this has a tremendous amount of benefit to companies, right? In terms of brand recall, brand experiences. There's plenty of body of knowledge and research around the power of memory recall as it pertains to smell. And I wonder, can you just talk a little bit about, some of the applications you're seeing, whether it's from consumer packaged goods or industrial companies such as Hyundai or Samsung, and how they're using this data. And it's quite novel in terms of, some of the applications that I've seen, such as detecting overheating of electrical wires or even wearing of tires, for example.
So it's a very good point, actually. Thank you, Scott. So we are, when we discovered our instrument, right, and the performances we could get from this instrument or from this sensor, we decided to work with, the most demanding industry, and clearly what we identified was the flavor and fragrance industry, and we're talking about companies who do for a living, aromas, natural extract of vanilla, rose, and so on and so forth, right? So they have a tremendous knowledge about what a smell is and what any culture can relate to a given smell and how you can combine actually odors and fragrances together. So we started to work with these companies and the main application that they saw at first was about quality control, right? So let's say you want to do a natural extract of roses, right? You want to make sure that your process is stable and is very efficient, right? So you want to control actually how your process is collecting the rose oil and make sure that you don't have any kind of variation over time. So as opposed to use actually individuals, because individuals, you cannot smell all the time. You have some kind of a fatigue when you smell. Devices such the one that we developed at Aryballe can smell essentially 24/7, right? So it's a very convenient tool to control and to track and to monitor a specific process. And then it comes when you want to create new fragrance, for instance. Let's say your professional knows you want to come up with how does the perfume react on a different type of skin. Right? So today you would smell actually different type of individual, different type of skin, different type of your perfume on different type of environment. Same thing if you want to see how your perfume behaves over time. a very difficult exercise to do, right? While with our device, we could decide to smell, or you could program to smell every 30 seconds for 24 hours, right? And see how the perfume evolves over time from, a head note to a body note to eventually a tail note, right? So this is this type of instrument, this is what they can provide, right? It's a consistent, objective way of smelling, and, the device doesn't have headache, the device doesn't, get any kind of sickness, right? So it can carry on over time. Right? So that's just for this, flavor and fragrance industry. When we talk about automotive, you can smell, the air cabin, you can smell, as you indicated, you can smell, we all have this experience when we drive our car. Something smells hot or something smells warm, as we say in French, right? So something is like kind of burning, right? So you don't know if at your dashboard, which is exposed to sun, which is starts to, heat up a little bit, or if you have an electrical wire that could potentially start to warm up and burn, right? So this is also the type of application that the device could be exposed to. You smell, any weird, odors.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it has applications to product development and, of course, the measure of customer experience, and it's so powerful because I think when we think about things like visual aid, for example, or ability to assess a person or an environment, we usually make a decision within the first 3 seconds. And part of that actually, is a very much, the smell that we take in as well. So in the case of, let's take the example of ride sharing and even hotels, because as some of the lockdown is starting to open up and people are starting to travel more, one of the things that's a big concern for them is, how clean, how sanitized are these ride sharing vehicles, as well as the hotels and the hotel rooms, for instance. How does smell help to ensure, certain quality, and that the smell is just the right blend, right? Where it's doesn't smell that kind of malodor, but yet at the same time, it doesn't have that harsh chemical, cleaning compound smell. So how can some of the data that you're collecting help inform some of these larger companies in hospitality and ride sharing, for instance?
You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit askyourperkins.com/events.
It's a very good point. You're right, because especially when you in a post-COVID world, because at one point we'll be living in a post-COVID world, and a lot of studies have been done about how we individuals relate to malodors, right? So, for instance, if you get into a very crowded bus or tramway or whatever, and if you have malodors, your feeling about the crowd is even worse, right? So, a crowded environment is even more, aggressive to you if there is, the presence of malodors, right? So it has been actually proven, and so if you can project yourself, where we are a little bit, paranoid about, catching viruses these days. If you are the operator of public transportation, how do you ensure that your users are going to, people will be using your services again, right? So you have to make sure that indeed there is some kind of feeling of quality, feeling of cleanliness, feeling of you feel good where you are, even if it's a crowded environment. Right? So smell becomes extremely important in this post-COVID world, and as you said, you don't want to have a chlorine to smell too much. You don't want you need a proper blend of smell, not too much, because a lot of culture actually don't relate to smell very well, right? So you want to have actually as neutral a smell as can be, and the ability to detect and essentially to actuate a purifier, because there is many ways to clean the air. If you could detect actually that the malodor exists, you could launch some kind of air purification to again make the the cabin, in a car, in the bus, clean again, and people feeling, at ease.
It's just so fascinating. There's so many dimensions that we can apply to. Now, there was a recent study that I believe your company had administered, and in that survey, 88% of respondents reported that odor can influence their purchasing behavior, citing a range of everything from strong fragrance in a department store, clothing items, to the smell that's maybe even gives hints that it's synthetic, or maybe produce that's just overripe, for instance. And then 93% of the respondents indicated that the smell, brought back very specific memories. And it's also correlated to some of this kind of lasting, longer term human behavior. I wonder if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on some of the insights that you gained from this survey.
If you allow me, let me take actually a side step. Right? Coming from the semiconductor industry, as I do, and in particular from the sensing world, sensor manufacturers, they essentially try to duplicate any human sense you can have, right? And if you think about your smartphone today, you have, you capture image, you capture sound, you can capture touch, you can capture motion, so you can capture a lot of, human senses. Yet, there is nothing that really captures emotions, right? And a lot of, people coming from the sensing world do think that smell is as close as you can get to, conveying emotions. And this is exactly the point, actually, that you made, actually, Scott, is that indeed, when you have a smell, it can trigger memories, it can trigger, and we can see, actually, and we can, also use it actually on ourselves. Is that, again, I was talking about, a crowded bus before with malodors. We don't feel at ease, right? You want to sell your house, there is recommendation that you should cook, you should bake some bread before, because, it makes people feel at ease in the house, right? So we do relate very much to smell. We do relate very much to odor, and again, as the studies you refer to are showing, there is a direct connection between smell and our memory. That's a given, right? So again, we're not behavioral psychologists at all, but we can just acknowledge that indeed there is a direct relationship for sure, right?
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point around, I guess, let's call it the Turing test, or more broadly, general artificial intelligence. This notion that at some point, sensors and collectively, integrated, smart systems can start to mimic components or aspects of what humans can do. Sight through computer vision, effective computing, touch, sensor pressure, movements, mechanical, and so forth. But part of missing in those modalities and sensors are really that olfactory aspect that you guys are addressing. I'm going to come back to this notion because I do think it's quite powerful in terms of the evolution of where AI and robotics can go, because this is a missing piece in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about the product itself. And first, if you could just explain a little bit more about your product called NEOS Advance, which I believe is a silicon photonic-based platform. And it's able to, detect the odor molecules, record it, and recognize that scent based on the, I guess, benchmarking against the database, for instance, right?
Yes. So as I mentioned before, we use actually essentially the same principles as your nose and your brain actually operate when it comes to smell, right? So your nose will capture olfactive, volatile olfactive compounds. And then it kind of builds an image in your olfactory bulb, actually here in front of your brain. And then there is it looks for a match in your olfactory memory somewhere in your brain, right? So essentially you have the three steps of capturing VOCs, building some kind of an image, right? So transferring converting VOCs into an image, and then actually comparing this image with your memory, right? So we do exactly the same steps, right? We use biosensors, which are very close to the one you have in your nose. So in your nose, you have proteins. We use fragment of proteins. So the same behavior. Essentially, our device can smell whatever your nose can smell, and it doesn't smell what your nose doesn't smell. That's very, very comparable. And then we build an image the same way, right? And then after we query, I like to call it an olfactive memory. It's actually an olfactive library, right? So we build libraries of smells. And if there is a match, it says, aha, this is cherry, this is walnut, this is, whatever. Or it says, I don't know what it is, but it's a woody type of smell, right? So then after, if you're an expert, you can say, this is some wood that I can actually annotate. This is the technical word that experts in artificial intelligence are using. So you can annotate this new smell, and here you go. You increase your olfactive library. So essentially, we use exactly the same steps. So this is for the sensor, and the product that you refer to, Neo's Advance, is a sensor that comes with bells and whistles, right? You have a screen, you can plug it onto a computer. You have actually a software that runs all of this. So essentially, it's the sensor which is embedded into a device, so that you can it's a handheld device. You can take it and you can smell whatever.
Yeah. So on the imaging, I guess some may refer to as signature. So it's this notion of distinctive odor signature that is converted into essentially a vision or image that the computers can understand and you can store properly in a metadata form. What happens in the case of, let's say, multi-odor? So in other words, is the system basically able to put different weights across different signatures so that it understands that if I'm baking, I'm not only baking chocolate chip cookies, but I'm also baking a baguette as well and maybe a loaf of bread?
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
An excellent question. So, if you allow me, let me walk you into the meander of artificial intelligence, right? We very often relate to big data, right? So essentially, big data means you have very big access to a lot of data. An access to a lot of data, right? And you can train your artificial intelligence engine, if you will, with a lot of combinations, right? So if you take autonomous car, right? A car, and if you can feed the artificial intelligence engine with a lot of combinations. For instance, if you see a helmet on top of a car, as a human that there is probably someone riding a bicycle behind the car because you understand what the scene is, right? If I can train my artificial intelligence engine with such a combination, and I say, if you just see the helmet and you see a car, there is very, very likely there is a bicycle, behind the car. Right? So with a lot of data, you can expose your engine, your artificial intelligence engine, to a lot of combinations, right? The issue we live in the small data world, right? So it's not only semantic, but we don't have access. It will come eventually, but today we don't have access to someone cooking bread at 270 degrees and together at the same time, cooking, meat and then actually eating a strawberry, right? If I could have access to this, I could actually provide all the combinations. It will come over time, but we live in the small data world, right? So we have to cope with this. So we cannot actually detect all the combinations. We will probably in that case say, bread is being cooked, right? There is something else. We don't quite know what it is, but there is something else, right? So this is essentially the limitations when you have limited access to annotated data, right?
Yeah, so I think going back to your earlier illustration of smartphones and the kinds of different types of sensors that it has, as let's say, for example, your capability gets integrated into smartphones, The smartphone is actually quite interesting because of the nature of the ubiquity. It kind of travels with you, and the kind of different contexts, from a coffee shop to your kitchen to airplane, for instance. It's going to pick up all those different smells that you're referring to, and it has contextual understanding because it has lat long. It has it's picking up your language because of, let's say, speech based, to text, NLP types of things that's integrated, like voice assistants, for instance. So it can start to actually help with the annotation. However, in the meantime, it sounds like there's quite a bit of, correct me if I'm wrong, classification, manual classification that needs to occur. Is that true? And how are you going about systematically and enriching, all the different V's of the big data when it comes to olfactory library?
But it's a very good point. I would challenge, however, the how expert any individual can be when it comes to smell. Right? There is not even actually an algorithm language when it comes to smell. Right? So, if we go back to the picture or image description, a cat is a cat is a cat. Right? If I know if I know the word for cat in Chinese, in Japanese, or in German, I can annotate with the proper word. Right? When it comes to smell, your definition of a strawberry smell is probably very different from mine, right? And let alone actually smells like a woody scent, or rain after sunshine, right? Or thunderstorm, or the smell after thunderstorm, right? So all of these experiences that we do live at an individual level is very difficult to convey and to express, right? Because there is not a lot of vocabulary when it comes to smell. So the quality of annotation, I think, will take a little bit of time to come, right? It will. I'm absolutely convinced it will, but it will take some time. And with this, the quality of the olfactive library also will take some time. So what we do for now is really to work with renowned and absolutely legit experts, the flavor and fragrance industry. They do this for a living. They have actually absolutely impressive data sheet about aromas and fragrances. They have this expertise, right? And what we intend to do is to help them digitalize, if I can use this word, their knowledge, and essentially convey and start to share their knowledge, because they have a lot of knowledge, difficult to share. But what we expect to do at Aryballe is really to together, right, with this digital olfaction capability, try to make this sense a little bit more easier to convey, easier to share, right? And again, with the limitations that we know today of limited, vocabulary, and essentially, I, as many other individuals, I thought the nose was only used to carry, glasses, right? And now, we discover that, again, with COVID, people losing the sense of smell, we realize how important it is, right? So it's probably a sense that we've been neglecting for quite some time, which, all of a sudden, comes back at us and say, hey, it's important, right? So.
Yeah. So, going back to the sense of smell loss from things like COVID, for example, I'm thinking about certain areas. You mentioned fragrance, certainly, but industries like wine and coffee, where they are actually very prescriptive and they're quite scientific, actually, in terms of the way they go about pulling out those annotations, to the point, I think, every time they taste, sample wine or coffee, for example, they're taking meticulous notes. And I wonder, to your point, just like the fragrance and the kind of, knowledge that exists but hasn't been quite digitized, can some of those industries that already are very professional, can they help to enlarge some of the characteristics? And again, that smell is both from a molecule, but also taking samples of the actual, I would suppose, some of the liquid as well, correct?
Yeah. So that you're absolutely right. I think the ability that with this device, especially when it's in the hand of experts, not only they helped us actually understand what the performances of the device could be, they helped us also drive the roadmap of our technology so that it exceeds what we thought it could do. To be completely transparent, right? We as non-experts, we were pretty satisfied at first with what it could do, right? And then when we got some feedback, experts told us, well, I want to discriminate this particular smell from this one. I know they are very close, on the smelling point of view, they are very close to each other. But I need to understand, what's the difference and how they can behave differently. So, the ability to discriminate, the ability to lower our level of detection, right, so that we could smell very small, tiny scents, right? The ability to also understand changes of intensity, because same thing, we are very poor in the way we quantify a smell. There is no graduation of intensity of smell. And yet we know that, from a low intensity smell to a high intensity smell, your nose will very likely be biased, right? It's the same smell at different intensity. Your nose will perceive a different smell. And with our device, we could demonstrate that it was still the same smell, but at a different intensity. So there is a lot of collective knowledge that we are developing together with our partners to better understand again how this device, our nose works, and this device, the one that we develop at Aryballe, work as well, right? So there is a lot of, I really think it's when you have a new instrument in hands. You learn about the instrument, you learn about the sense at the same time. So there is some kind of collective knowledge that we are building here. And this is exactly what we're experiencing today. It's a very exciting journey because we learn how to make olfaction a more objective sense, which it's clearly lacking today.
So I know we're almost out of time. I think so far we've been looking at it from the perspective of identification of sense and senses. But I think at some point, in terms of forward-looking, is that at some point, as the library gets enriched and enlarged, that there's also ability to actually create some of these orders on demand. And that has huge implication, like we talked about, in terms of memory recall. So, for example, if I'm selling, for example, baby products, and I want to infuse certain smells, let's say milk or baby powder, or certain smells that associates that, and it just gives that additional kind of comfort that I'm buying the best product, for instance. Or you want to trigger certain things, certain emotions, for instance. When do you think we'll start to be able to actually actuate and affect our memory, but also her behavior as well?
Well, we already work with some other partners about very small, tiny actuators, right? So that can diffuse smells, right? So the technology to diffuse a smell, right? It's not a spray, because a spray it's very big droplets and they tend to fall, right in front of the diffuser, right? But if you have actually, if you're able to diffuse very small, tiny droplets, essentially they will be airborne, right? So they just float in the air as any smell would, right? So this technology exists. It's very close, by the way, to the technology of inkjet printer, right? They just send very small, tiny droplets, right? So this technology exists already. What we don't really understand today is what I was relating to primary odors at first, right? So we could easily diffuse a preset of smells, right? We could even decide to combine the preset of smells, but we are not yet at generating any smell from a limited set of primary odors. We don't have this yet, right? But to be able to diffuse a preset of smells, that's something that we should be able to do fairly quickly, right? Again, not droplets, but very small, tiny droplets that can actually be airborne. Right? So this is very close to being there. And essentially, when you combine an actuator and a sensor, you have the whole story, right? So you can actually detect that you're lacking the smell that you want to diffuse. So you can actually actuate you can actuate and diffuse more, and you can actually have the balance that you need.
Very exciting. And with that, I have been joined by Sam Guilaumé, who is the CEO of Aryballe. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.